Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from AnthonyMorganti.com. Recently, I completed a couple new video series. One was called Mastering Luminar 2018. The other one was called Mastering Aurora HDR 2018. And I'm currently recording a new series called Mastering on One Photo RAW 2018. And my plan is to reboot my Lightroom series with a new Lightroom series before the end of the year, hopefully, called Mastering Lightroom Classic CC. And it kind of occurred to me recently that in these videos, I'll tell you to push this slider that way and pull this slider this way, but I never really explain my philosophy, why I process an image the way I process it. And I'm not sure if any of the other people on YouTube that teach photography, if they've gone into great detail or not, but I just know that I haven't. And I think that I'd like to express to you why I do the things I do as far as processing and as far as composition. Now, let me say before I begin this disclaimer, I make no claim that this is the only way to shoot and process images, nor am I saying that any other way might be wrong or stupid. There's probably some great photographers out there that do the opposite of what I do, and their images look great. This is just the way I do it, and I want to explain to you why I do the things I do. I'm merely explaining the way I do things as reference for those that watch my videos can understand my philosophy. My hope is that this educates and stimulates you to investigate how other photographers compose and edit so that you could come up with something unique that works for you. So, with that disclaimer in place, let me just try to explain why I do the things I do. And we're going to start out with composition. I am a firm believer in the so-called compositional rules. Although I do not like to call them rules, I would prefer to call them suggestions. And let me say that when I say anything I'm talking about today isn't really an absolute. We're not really, you have to shoot in the rule of thirds. You have to do this. You have to do that. Everything is optional. And that's what makes photography great. Because if we always did things exactly by the rule, then all our images would look alike and it would be pretty boring. So these are just suggestions. These are things that I keep in mind when I'm out shooting and what I think usually works for me. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a firm believer in these so-called compositional rules. And part of the reason I am, it's because this was really, especially the golden ratio, it was discovered by the ancient Greeks, and you could see this little slide that I pulled off of Google search. And it says that the golden ratio throughout history, the ratio for length to width of rectangles was 1.61803 and so on, has been considered the most pleasing to the eye. This ratio was named the golden ratio by the Greeks. In the world of mathematics, the numeric value is called phi, named for the Greek sculptor Phidias. Now, some people call it phi. I found that mostly people from the UK call it phi, and it seems like usually the United States call it phi. I've always called it phi. That's what my instructor called it. And it's just something that you have to keep in mind. Our monkey brains are kind of hardwired in a way to recognize something as being attractive or pleasing to look at. And the golden ratio, as discovered by the ancient Greeks, and Phidias lived, I think, before, like a generation before Socrates. So we're talking about, 350, 400 BC, something like that. So anyway, they've discovered that this is this type of ratio is pleasing to our monkey brains for some reason. And it's true today. So I try to use the rule of thirds, which is a decent approximation of the golden ratio, and I'll show you that in a minute. But I really don't go out and look for a rule of thirds situation to take a picture of. What I do, I often will look for other these kind of rules or suggestions. I look for leading lines, and that includes diagonal lines, converging lines, diverging lines, or divergent lines. Framing, I like to frame things. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail what each of these are. And if you're interested in me doing maybe a video series where I talk about these in detail, let me know in the comments below, and I will do a series where maybe I'll have a series on visual weight and show you what it means. But I look for that. Sometimes I'll be out and I see, wow, this is a great shot where I could use visual weight or complementary colors or the law of odd numbers, law of similarity, law of pragnance, the law of continuity, the law of closure. Now, that's just some of it. I mean, there's other things. There's like, utilizing empty space, although that's kind of falls under the law of pragnance. But there's a lot of others too. And I don't really fill my brain with all these and get into neuron overload when I'm out shooting. But being familiar with all these and understanding what they mean, when I am out shooting, I might see a scene and say, wow, there's some complementary colors in here. And I'll shoot the scene in such a way that will exploit the complementary colors. The whole idea of my philosophy, at least when I'm out shooting, is I want when someone views an image of mine, I want them to look where I want them to look. And I want them to ignore what I want them to ignore. And by utilizing one of these or one or more of these compositional rules, you could get the viewer to look at the image the way you want them to look at it. So what I'll often do, I might see the law of odd numbers or the triangle rule, something like that, that's not listed here, but I'll see it and I'll frame it maybe in a rule of thirds way that will exploit it so that the other things in the image that aren't important aren't really noticeable as much as the odd numbered triangle things that I'm talking about in the image, and I want people to notice. So that is very important to me. So like I said, I just am familiar with all these different types of compositional rules, and I will go out shooting, not necessarily looking for one, but I will look at a scene and I could see how I could exploit it to my advantage. It may be using visual weight, it may be using framing, it may be using a leading line. I don't know. It all depends. And then I often will use rule of thirds to finish off or to frame the shot in such a way. Now, I mentioned, rule of thirds. Here's an image here. Now, if I open up the crop tool, it comes with an overlay, and you really can't see it. So what I should probably do is, let's see. Okay, if I turn exposure all the way up, you could hopefully in the video see these lines. And this is the rule of thirds. And you can see where I put the sailboat over here at this point of intersection, and I have this woman who is sitting on the beach at this point of intersection here. And that is how you would utilize the rule of thirds or the golden ratio. And I could change this overlay by hitting the O key on my keyboard. This, what you're seeing now, I hit the O key once. This is actually the golden ratio. And you can see it's close to the rule of thirds. My point is, or the reason why I do this is in my camera, both in my Nikons and in my Fuji, I have overlays in the viewfinder that are rule of thirds overlays. So I could easily frame something to create this type of layout. Unfortunately, the cameras do not have the golden ratio layout, or I might prefer to use that. Also, what goes along with this is what's often called the golden spiral, and that's still related to the golden ratio. It's using the Fibonacci sequence to plot this spiral. And you can see the woman is relatively close to that. So because I can't really shoot or frame through my viewfinder for the golden spiral, I will often crop my image to take advantage of the golden spiral if I think I need to, but not always. So like I said, nothing's written in stone, and I don't necessarily shoot this way every single time, but these are things I look out for. Now, another thing we should talk about is colors. Typically, you might see me have a image like this that is very vibrantly colored, but I don't have any more than one color, and I even try to avoid one color saturated. The reason being is the physiological makeup of our eye. We have, rods and cones in your eye, and the cone cells in your eye see colors. And typically, if you have more than one color saturated, your cones, well, even with just one saturated color, if I'm looking at it, now the blue is pretty saturated in this image. So if I look at it, it kind of burns out your cones within 2 to 3 seconds. And you will subconsciously have to look away from the color so that your cone could recharge or your cones could recharge. Then you could look back. If you have a lot of the color saturated, it won't be pleasing for your viewer to look at because there's nowhere for their eyes or their cones to recharge. So they look off the image. And you don't want them to look off the image. You always want them to look on the image. So in processing, I usually try not to have a large portion or more than one color saturated. And typically that would be your primary additive colors, red, green, and blue. We see trichromatic vision, they call it, where we tend to have cones, red, green, and blue cones in our eye, although we have more red and green, and I think it's the red is shaded a little more, or it's keyed a little more towards yellow than it is red, technically. But for the sake of argument, they say we have red, green, and blue cones. So with that said, in this image I have blue pretty saturated and everything else is rich and strong, but not really saturated. So usually in processing, I don't want to saturate more than one color. So keep that in mind. It may help you make your images more pleasing to look at. Also, when we tend to look at an image, our eyes will tend to fall on the brightest part of the image first. Now, I usually don't want that bright part to be something that I don't want them to see. Meaning, if the action is in the middle of the image, I don't want the bright part way out here to the outside because they're going to stare at that brighter part first. You kind of want them to look at what you want them to look at, right? So in this case, if I had a lab test here and I could sense someone's eyes focusing on this image when it flashes in front of them, I would imagine they're going to look over here first. But because it's such a strong composition as far as the rule of thirds are concerned, they will look over here, but then they'll tend to see the other two elements that I want them to look at, the sailboat and the woman, which fall on those rule of third points. So again, you don't want the brightest part of your image usually out towards the edges of the frame. That is part of the reason why I often put a dark vignette on my image, but I put a very slight one. A darker vignette will keep their eyes more towards the middle of the image because it's going to be a little brighter in the middle than it would be around the edges. And on this image, you can see I have a very slight vignette, -15. You probably can't even notice it consciously, but subconsciously, our brain will see that it's slightly darker out here and tend to keep the person's eyes more towards the middle of the image. So that's why I prefer to put a slight dark vignette, and that's what I often call it. Now, another thing, generally speaking, about my photography is I don't like to have it all super tack sharp usually. You can see now she is very, very well focused, this person. The beach in the foreground here is very well focused, very sharp. Then it really starts to lose some definition as we go back. And we could tell it's not super blurry, but it's not tacked sharp either. You don't want that because, again, it kind of burns out your eyes because if you're looking at something that's very sharp, and you'll want to look away. Now, this is part of the reason in portraiture we tend to like to use wide open lenses. We buy those really expensive 1.4 aperture, 1.2 aperture lenses so we could do portraiture so that we could really blur out the background. It really makes the subject pop out from the image. It separates them from the background, but it also gives somewhere for your eyes to rest. You're looking at the very sharp part of the image, and then you could rest just by momentarily, subconsciously looking at the blurry part. But the blurry part forces your eye back onto the sharp part. So that's why this image isn't as good as that image, generally speaking. You prefer to not have everything super sharp. You'd rather have really the part you want your viewer to look at to be sharp, and the parts you don't want them to look at to be less sharp. Let's put it that way. So that is kind of my general philosophy of what I do as far as composition, color, and what I have sharp and not sharp. Or sharp. Our whole thing, I think, at least my whole thing, when I'm out taking pictures, is I want to maximize the best part of the scene and minimize the worst part of the scene. And you do that with a combination of compositional rules and aperture, and then in post-production, in processing, and including the tonal range of your image. As I mentioned, you don't want the super bright parts way outside toward the edges, usually. Now, again, nothing's written in stone. This is all very generally speaking. There's exceptions to every rule, but that's something to think about. Now, as far as how I process an image, I kind of borrowed my philosophy from color grading film, digitally enhancing film, let's put it that way, or just video. All right, I borrowed my philosophy from that. Typically, in video, you would shoot the scene as flat as possible with low contrast, high dynamic range, and a flat color profile. And this gives you a solid base for what they call in video or video grading, color grading. It gives you a solid base because it's allowing you to manipulate the color and sharpness yourself rather than fighting with the colors your camera has already applied to the footage. That's why I and many others advocate that you shoot raw. Raw is really a very flat image is what you get. If you shoot just JPEG, your camera already sharpened, added some vibrance and or saturation to it, and added contrast to the image. Now you have to fight what your camera did to kind of make it what you want it to be. On the other hand, if you shoot raw and you shoot it very flat so that it's just not a high contrast, vibrant raw file, you're better able to make it your own. And it tends to minimize noise. And noise is important to me because many times my prints or my images get printed to very large prints. Like just recently, I sold an image for a 6x9 print, 6 foot by 9 foot. So a lot of times my images are on sides of buses or on billboards, and I need, for those type of things, I need noise to be minimal. And if you shoot very flat, it's easier to get rid of what noise is there. And to demonstrate a little bit more about my philosophy, I have this image here, which is by far not a perfect image, but I'll show you how I do it. Now, it's totally not processed at all. It's a straight raw file, straight from the camera. One thing I do on import into Lightroom is I have it default so that I don't add any sharpening at all. By default, on most cameras that I know of, raw files, when you import the raw file into Lightroom, Lightroom will give it a default sharpening of 25. I change that to 0, and I do have a Lightroom quick tips video where I say how you could change your defaults so when you import an image, you do some processing to it automatically. And one of the things I do is I remove the processing of sharpening at 25. I have it at 0. The other thing I do on import, I have it apply lens corrections immediately so I don't have to do that later. So that as my images get imported into Lightroom, lens corrections are applied automatically and detail is set to 0. So now I have this super flat, unsharpened image. And you've probably seen me many times. The first thing I do is I take highlights down, and I don't necessarily, I know some photographers bring them all the way down automatically, and they go to shadows and bring those all the way up automatically. Now, I don't normally do that, although in my very early Lightroom training, I will teach a student to do it that way because it's just easier for them to start out. Usually, though, what I'll do is I'll bring highlights down until I see detail throughout all the highlighted areas. Now, in this case, there's nothing very bright in this shot necessarily. So if there was, I would bring this down until I see detail. If this was a tiger with whiter fur instead of a snow leopard, and it had really white, or let's say it was an Arctic fox, has white fur. It's the middle of winter. And I would bring highlights down till I really see detail throughout her fur. Now, this is a snow leopard, and it doesn't really have some bright or, snow white fur. So I would just bring this down a bit. Shadows, I would open up until I see detail in the darkest areas of the image. Now I've just made my flat raw file flatter. Now, one thing I should say is the way I process images has evolved. If you watched any of my videos from when I first started doing videos 2.5, 3 years ago, it's a little different now because I kind of evolved with the technology, but I also evolved a little bit on myself, how I like to do it and how I've discovered seems to work better for me. And this is where I encourage you to experiment and see what works for you. So I made the image very flat. Usually, at this point, I would send it to a noise reduction program because I found that it's easier to remove noise when you don't add any clarity, don't add any sharpness, you don't really add a lot of contrast with even moving those white or black sliders at all. And it just seems like the noise is easier to get rid of, and you retain a lot of the detail that was already in the image. The problem with noise reduction is it tends to soften everything. And if you add a lot of clarity, a lot of sharpness, a lot of contrast, then when you send it to the noise reduction program, or you even use the detail tab in Lightroom to remove noise, you tend to lose that detail. You're going to be making it really soft. So I like to use Topaz Denoise. It's the best I've used. Now, I haven't used them all. I've used maybe 3 different programs ever. But to me, Topaz Denoise works great. So at this point, I would send the image to Topaz Denoise. The problem, though, in doing that, I lose my raw file because it becomes a TIFF file. So before I send it to Topaz Denoise, I got to make sure my white balance is perfect. So make sure my white balance is perfect because that's going to get baked into the TIFF file. So I want to make sure that white balance is correct. Then I'll send it over to Topaz Denoise. When it comes back from Topaz Denoise, as I mentioned, it's a 16-bit TIFF file. Then I'll continue with my processing. Now, what I want to do is I want to add some contrast to it. Now, I don't use the contrast slider usually. And I do have a video on this. I believe it was a Lightroom Quick Tips video where I explained the difference between using the contrast slider and the tone curve to get or to add contrast to an image. I draw from this from the same thing from that video grading or color grading video. You tended not to use, they didn't use contrast slider, you used a tone curve. The tone curve is a little more precise, and I could demonstrate this very quickly with the histogram. If you look at the histogram now, if I take the contrast slider and I move it to the right, you're seeing that the whole histogram is just widening, and we're making more midtone. We're basically adding contrast everywhere, from the shadows to the highlights and the midtones. Everything's getting kind of spread out. Now, if I go to the tone curve and I just even use this drop down, I'm using the point curve as opposed to the region curve. If I use this drop down and I just go to strong contrast, look at the histogram, and you'll see that the midtones didn't move as much, but we moved a lot in the shadows and the highlights. So it's a little more precise of adjustment. And I could come in here and manually come in here and make my shadows even a little darker if I want, and my highlights a little darker, but I'm not affecting the midtones as much. Now, the advantage of doing it that way is it's just giving you a little more precise control. And when you come in here with the clarity slider, clarity is really mid-tone contrast. And then if you look at the histogram, when I move the clarity slider to the right, I'm really affecting more of the midtones. It's affecting, you can see, I guess it's affecting everything, but trust me on this, that's also been called the mid-tone contrast slider. Now, as I move, what I found now with doing it this way, not using the contrast slider, I could get away with adding more clarity to the image. And it seems to look balanced and look good. The other thing doing it this way is you could add a little more sharpness to the image. So you could go down to the detail panel and get away with really boosting sharpness way up, and it won't look over sharp. So that's what, why I prefer to use the tone curve. Now, I mentioned I don't like more than one color saturated. As a matter of fact, I'd rather not have any one color saturated unless it calls for it. You got a really colorful balloon, a hot air balloon or something, and it's red. You might want it saturated. So it depends. But in this case here, we don't want anything really saturated. So I might bring vibrance up a little bit. And vibrance, I prefer usually oversaturation, because vibrance won't oversaturate anything. It usually will just bring everything to saturation, but not oversaturate. So I will up vibrance. And even then, I usually don't go over 20 and often don't even go over 15. I just bring it up a little. And I almost never move saturation, although sometimes I might just pop it a little bit. Like this cat, her eyes were really beautiful. So it's not really coming out in the image. So I would probably either bring saturation up a little bit, but it's kind of making the rocks a little more colorful than they actually were. Or I would go to the brush and I would bring saturation up on a brush. Then I would come in on her eyes. And now I didn't send this, you could see the noise there. I did not send this to Topaz Denoise. Now I would have, obviously, in real life, I would have sent this to Topaz Denoise. So I would bring saturation up a touch on her eyes because they were quite compelling. So that's why I tend to shoot raw, always shoot raw actually, and why I tend to bring highlights down and shadows up and make the image actually flatter, because then I'll send it to Topaz Denoise. It's easier to get rid of the noise, and I still will retain a lot of detail. Then when I come back, I add contrast via the tone curve, and then I will come in here with the whites and black slider too. And usually I don't have to move these very much. And to tell you the truth, usually I just eyeball it. I just bring it up to my visual liking, up or down. I don't necessarily move like the black slider always to the left and the white slider always to the right. Again, when I teach Lightroom, I teach two different ways to do it. You hold the Alt or Option key in, Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac, and you click on, let's say, the white slider, and your screen will turn black. And then you would move white until you start to clip, and then back it off until the clipping is just about gone. And then similarly for blacks, you hold that Alt or Option key in and click on that, and you would move the black slider until it clips. You start seeing that color, so you're clipping blacks. So you move that back until that's gone. And that's the way I teach it. Alternatively, the other way I would show people is you hold the Shift key in and double click on the word whites, and you'll get kind of a, I guess, the Lightroom recommended white point, and hold that Shift key in and double click on blacks, and you'll get the Lightroom recommended black point. Sometimes I will do that just to see what it looks like, and then I will move it on my own from there. And that's probably what I usually do. So I usually save the whites and blacks for last or near last to get an idea. Often when I do that, I probably should do sharpening last, but because I often have to come back in here and tone down sharpening a little bit. So that's the way I do things, usually. And again, nothing is written in stone. I don't really, it's much more, like I'm making it sound like it's very mechanical the way I do things, or very like scientific. It isn't. It isn't. It's just the way I've developed maybe is based on physiological, as far as color in your eyes, cones, or psychological, rule of thirds, or it's based on science as far as color grading. But the way when I'm actually doing it, it's more by feel. Now, one thing I should add, that I bullseyed this shot when I shot it, which is horrible. I hate cropping. I really do. I'd rather compose it perfectly in camera. Sometimes you can't. There was a wicked reflection over here, and you could see it here. So this isn't a shot that I would share. I just chose it because I thought it was a very average shot, and I could show you how I would process it. And you can see there's wild reflection here. But imagine that reflection wasn't there. I would open up the crop tool. I would use rule of thirds. And let me see, there it is. And now I would try to put the cat's eye on one of the points of intersection on the rule of thirds. And I know you probably can't see this in the video because I could barely see it on my computer screen, but that point of intersection is right there. And there's no way I could move her eye over that. So what I'll do then is I'll keep her eye over the line, this line. So if you can't be on a point of intersection, put the point you want at least over one of the lines. In this case, it'll be this left-hand vertical line. So I have that going right through her pupil. Now, I could crop it way in and get her eye in one of the rule of thirds, but I don't want to crop it too much. As I mentioned, I often get my prints sold that are really large, and I don't want to crop away all those pixels because I need them. And I don't want to crop out her paw over here. So that's just personal preference. So that's the way I probably would crop this image. And if this reflection wasn't here, it would be a decent image. But because that reflection's there, it's not really a usable image. Now, again, let me reiterate that this, I make no claim again that this is the only way to do this. There's millions of ways to do this. And I respect any way someone else does it. As a matter of fact, I'm interested in how other people do it because I might learn from them and modify my approach and how I go about doing these things. So I just wanted to put this out there because, again, I'm doing all these video series and I say I do this and I do that, and I never really explained why I do what I do. This is why. All right. Again, if you would be interested, I don't know, let me know. I don't know how exciting this would be, but I'll do, let's say, a video on leading lines, a video on framing, a video on, all of these and some others. If you'd be interested in that, let me know in the description below or in the comments below. And that's it for this video. Thank you, everyone that watches my videos. I really do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.